They were designed to be the best. They met enemies face to face, endured tragedies and enjoyed victories. They went down in history due to the bravery of their crews. They are the ships that deserve to be called Naval Legends.
In this episode, Australia's daring destroyers. The first colonists of Australia had to fight all the time. They faced heat, lack of water, flies, snakes, and even ostriches. And today the Australians still cannot live without fighting. Every day they fight boredom, trying to conquer the waves. They created AC/DC, whose rock swept the world like a hurricane.
Nothing disturbed the country. No wars, no aggressors. The Germans, French, and Russians were nowhere around, so they basically focused on making their lives better. The first time the Australians really felt a threat to their way of life was when World War II began. It was the so-called Japanese Blitzkrieg, when, within half a year, or maybe a year, Japan advanced from their home islands to the coast of Australia.
In February 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked the city of Darwin in Australia. Japan was expanding its empire, mainly by occupying territories in Southeast Asia. Though Australia was not part of their plan, military bases of the United States and the Allies stationed on the Green Continent were undermining Japan's intentions to dominate the Pacific, and the Royal Australian Navy was actively involved in the Pacific War until the very end of World War II.
Following the end of the Second World War, moving into the Cold War, Australia still realized that it needed to have a defensive asset in its Navy, so it moved to bringing in a new generation of vessels, of which the Daring class destroyers were a member.
The Daring class was essentially designed as the Royal Navy's super destroyer. Australia decided to build 3 Darings, being Vampire, Vendetta and Voyager.
The British designed the Daring class, relying on their experience of using destroyers in World War II and the progress in arms development. The Australian-built destroyers were somewhat different from their British counterparts. In terms of their specifications, the Darings were similar to light cruisers. Total displacement, about 3,800 tons. Length, almost 120 meters. Beam, a little over 13 meters. Draft, 4 meters. Armament. When commissioned, the Darings were equipped with versatile guns featuring the best rate of fire in the world. 6 113mm Mark V guns mounted in 3 dual turrets. As for small caliber anti-aircraft guns, the ships had 6 40mm Bofors autocannons. Torpedo armament. 1 5-tube 533mm torpedo launcher. Anti-submarine armament, 1 3-barreled 305mm Mark X anti-submarine mortar. The power plant consisted of 2 Foster Wheeler boilers and 2 English electric turbines and provided 54,000 horsepower. Maximum speed, over 30 knots. Cruising range, 3,700 nautical miles at 20 knots.
The Australian-built Darings were the first all-welded construction vessels, warships built in Australia.
The ship incorporated all the best design features developed during World War II. Speed, maneuverability, artillery guns, a fire control system, radars, everything was there. All these systems were researched and implemented in the Darings. In a way, this was a perfect ship, with just one exception. She was built after the first missiles were already produced.
In the early 1970s, the Darings were fitted with surface-to-air missiles. Despite this, they remained mainly artillery ships, and they were the last ones of their kind. The destroyer's main turrets were their pride. 113mm versatile guns could fire 24 rounds per minute and showed themselves to be advantageous during World War II. The Darings were equipped with the QF Mark V version of these guns, which was a post-war upgrade. The turrets had a distinctive shape and made the destroyers easy to recognize.
This is the gun bay, or gun turret A on the Daring-class destroyers. This is where the shells and the cartridges were assembled before being sent up to the guns. This is an incredibly challenging and very dangerous place to work on the ship. It was confined, and as you can imagine, you've got high explosives being sent into this room, so there was the danger of explosion or fire. And if that weren't difficult enough, this bay actually rotated as the gun above rotated. Sometimes the rotation would occur without any warning and any indication of where it was going to go. So you could be in the middle of trying to assemble a shell, and all of a sudden the entire bay would move and you'd have to shift with it.
World War II created the communist threat for Western civilization, the Western way of thinking, and communism was already nearby. The United States created the domino theory in this regard. What does this mean? It means if Vietnam falls into communism, then Laos falls, Thailand falls, Indonesia falls, and Australia falls too, and the people in Australia believe this.
After World War II, the Soviet Union rapidly built up its influence, which spread from Western Europe and China to the Caribbean Sea, and some exotic monarchies in the Indonesian archipelago. Military coups and revolutions were shattering tropical islands in the Pacific, and the Australians, who led their quiet life, felt quite concerned about this. Now they needed protection, not from their bombs and kamikazes, but from vigorous revolutionaries who could destroy their Australian serenity.
The ships essentially served around Southeast Asia under the Southeast Asian Treaty Organisation, and often spent a lot of time in Singapore. Essentially, the only vessel which saw service out of the class was the Vendetta, which did a short period of time in Vietnam.
An Australian contingent of about 50,000 men participated in combat operations in Vietnam, and Australia got involved in this war several years before the United States interfered in the conflict. At first, 30 Australian military advisors were sent to South Vietnam, but a couple of years later, a several thousand-strong military force was deployed there. They required supplies, which were brought by transport convoys from Australia. Darings were among the ships protecting them. Despite the fact that Australia was officially at war, it was hardly felt aboard escort ships. Of course, the service wasn't anything like a pleasure trip. However, one of the major concerns for the destroyer crews was to win the Gloucester Cup, the main award for naval exercises.
I think the amazing thing about Vampire was that it was an extremely happy ship. And I think that was because there was a lot of trainees on board, and the atmosphere there was, give everything a go. Don't worry about it. Just get in there and do your best.
We're standing in HMAS Vampire's Operations Center. It's directly below the wheelhouse. The nickname for this room is called the Bat Cave. That's because HMAS Vampire's nickname was the Bat. It looked a lot like a cave, and at the time that Vampire was operational, Batman, and particularly the TV show, was a very popular thing. So it was given the nickname based on that information.
The Darings were a top ship. They were a very friendly ship, or especially Vendetta was. Everyone in the crew used to get along together. There was hardly any ever fights.
However, any joyful existence can be darkened by tragedy. This is a fact of life, and cheerful Australian sailors didn't manage to escape it.
Unfortunately, the Australian Navy lost the Voyager in 1964 with a large loss of life.
On the 10th of February 1964, HMAS Voyager, one of the Daring-class destroyers, was struck by the aircraft carrier HMAS Melbourne during maneuvers off Jervis Bay, New South Wales, Australia. The ship was hit just after the bridge, and it broke in half and rolled over.
I don't think that the Voyager's crew was poorly organized. I don't think that the Melbourne's crew was poorly organized. It was an accident. Something got overlooked, and a sequence of errors led to this collision.
Sitting there, being on Vendetta, they sat there and were always told, you know, there is escape point 1, escape point 2, go down this way. If we get sliced in half, and you start going down, go up, you know, sit there, know where all the escape point was. And that's how we done it.
One of those to die aboard the ship was Chief Petty Officer Jonathan Rogers, who was too big to fit through the escape hatch, but helped other crewmen get through the escape hatch before he led those who were still stuck in the ship in hymns and prayers as the ship sank.
This tragedy left a deep wound in the hearts of Australian sailors, but soon their life returned to normal. Exercises, regattas, and patrol duties. Many veterans remember their years of service aboard the Australian Darings as the best and most carefree time in their life, though the destroyers went on serious combat missions a couple of times. In other respects, the most dangerous challenges that the Daring's crews faced were visits to local bars, and the consequences were comical rather than sad. Friendly and well-knit crews of the Daring-class destroyers were very highly trained and were rewarded by the command of the Royal Australian Navy on multiple occasions.
It's not easy to serve in the Navy, but they were young, they were happy, they accomplished some tasks. Yes, he swabs the deck, but then he will go ashore. He will be a sailor. He'll be in the spotlight.
As a junior recruit, like leaving school in the morning, joining the Navy in the afternoon and then sent to Lewin, all in the same day. The Royal Australian Navy to me was life-changing. Sit there and set me on my career, and I've never looked back. It was the best 12 years of my life I've ever spent. I'd actually wish I'd done it to 20, or even longer, but the crew on Vendetta at the time, it was all one crew. It didn't matter whether you were a stoker, a greenie, a cook, a dib-dab, you know, even some of the officers and chiefs. They'd all drink together. You know, we'd all go in a bar and meet them, oh yeah, glug. You know, which hardly ever happened on other ships. It was just such a good camaraderie on the ship. That's why we, you know, life is great on 08.
In the 1980s, when new wave music began conquering the world, the Australian destroyers from the rock and roll era became history. Voyager and 83 members of her crew rested at the bottom of the sea. Vendetta was scrapped.
She was scrapped. She was sent there and sent to Taiwan and basically ended up as a razor blade, you know, all the steel. She was, you know, I wish they'd sat there and sunk it as a reef, but they weren't sinking ships back then for reefs. There was still money in steel.
Luck was kind to Vampire alone. She was decommissioned in 1986, but remained intact. This museum ship, located in Sydney's Darling Harbour, has the right to be considered a memorial to all Australian darings. She is the last of them.
And all the parts that went off Vendetta are now on Vampire, which is the museum ship you just looked at. There's probably, I'd say there's a good 40% of Vendetta still floating on Vampire.
So I'm very glad that they saved HMAS Vampire from the scrap heap, because she does represent an era of the Navy of which I'm very proud. The privations of steamships and the great spirit of the crews.